Welcome to Coming Together, Coming Apart, Episode 5, The Eye of the Master. Before we get rolling today, I figure it's high time I properly introduce myself now that we are in Episode 5. I am Trevor Owens, the host, producer, researcher, writer, and creator of Coming Together, Coming Apart. Been working on this now for a few months, since about February or March, a couple weeks before the pandemic really hit hard here in the US. And things have changed a lot since then. Coming Together, Coming Apart was not the original title of the podcast. I was going to go for a more specific A History of. But that changed once I was a few weeks into researching for this series and thinking about how to maintain a podcast after the first series, and what really draws my interest. I don't even think I came up with the title until about 2 or 3 weeks before anything was even published. Everything up to that point was still a history of the Korean War. First idea I had about this was to talk about Vietnam, because I have some knowledge of the country from a project I did a couple years ago with the US Embassy in Hanoi. It's also a set of massively important conflicts drawing in a lot of political, moral, and ethical themes, as well as spanning the entirety of the Cold War and highlighting a lot of the different political aspects of the period. The, for the lack of a better term, Indochina Wars, which I think lasted from like 1945 to 1990 or something, are just kind of a lot to bite off for a first podcast. That's how I landed on Korea. I thought the Korean War would be a shorter and easier place to test the waters of podcasting, specifically, how to build a deeper history podcast. Shorter, of course, is relative. This series will probably be around 30 or 40 episodes. I haven't figured that part out yet. I have about 20 episodes planned out so far, and I'm currently figuring out what the rest will look like. Coming from an American point of view, Korea is often referred to as a forgotten war, which is ludicrous because it's mentioned in the news a lot of times when either North Korea or South Korea is mentioned. Also, most wars are probably forgotten when you get out of an academic bubble. It's a hugely important conflict when discussing the wider Cold War, which is how I settled on it for the first series. Finally, Koreans have not forgotten about the war. What people probably mean when they say it's forgotten is that Americans have forgotten. It's sandwiched between two other conflicts that shaped the American psyche in very specific ways. World War II was just 5 years earlier, and people were tired of war by the time Korea rolled around. Just a bit after it ended, Vietnam kicked up and really made us question who we were as a nation, and that's something we as a country have not really reckoned with since then. Today's episode title is something we will actually talk about next week. While today is a full-length episode on its own, it really acts as part 1 of 2. Last week, I ended the episode saying that we would discuss the first few weeks of each occupation this week. Going through my notes, though, I decided it was better to deal with the first few months of the Soviet occupation, and then the first few months of the American occupation. So that's what we'll do. Today, we will discuss one thing: the beginnings of the Soviet occupation in northern Korea, above the 38th parallel. Next week, we will discuss the beginnings of the American occupation in southern Korea, below the 38th parallel. To quickly recap the last 2 weeks before getting back into our history, the Koreans founded the Korean People's Republic in Seoul, the Soviets invaded Manchuria and Korea just before the Japanese surrendered in the middle of August, and the Americans got the Soviets to agree to divide the Korean peninsula at the 38th parallel. Neither the Soviets nor the Americans intended to stay in Korea for too long. There wasn't a set timetable for withdrawal, as that was contingent on whether or not a unified Korean government was established with the approval of the Soviets and Americans. The plan was for the occupation to last as long as was necessary for the Allies to negotiate the details of what that unified Korean government would look like. I really want to emphasize that unified point. No one thought that there would or should be 2 Koreas at this time. Everyone was more or less working towards one Korean government, even if, by the middle of August 1945, the Korean peninsula was divided as it would remain mostly to this day. I've held off on talking about something pretty important up to this point. It is time to talk about communism, at least a little bit. The reason I've not talked about the theoretical framework of communism before this is because I don't really think the theories are that important to our history. That, of course, could change as we get further into the story and as I research more and more about this, but right now, with everything I've read so far and everything I know, or at least I think I know, about communism and socialist theory, I just don't think it's that important to what we're trying to talk about. Korean communism took off after the Japanese annexed Korea as a colony in 1910, and just before we really get to see communism put into practice in the Soviet Union. Korean communism, like many other forms of communism that arose in colonial areas, grew as a specifically anti-colonial nationalistic form of communism that was guided and supported by the Soviets. So what we end up with is these two sides of communism in a lot of places like Korea. There's the international aspect of communism with the Soviet Union acting as a guiding light for communists around the world, and there's the domestic aspect of communism centered around anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and nationalism. Like many people living in colonially subjugated areas, Korean communists were first and always Koreans, and communists second. I do think we need some understanding of what it means to be communist and what a communist state looks like, and I do want to talk about that briefly. I am no philosopher, and I would hardly call myself an expert on communist theory or practice at this point, so I am very much open to discussion on any of these points. If I say anything wrong here, I will correct it at some point, but all of the following is correct to the best of my knowledge. If you are interested in more fully understanding communist theory and practice, I highly recommend the 8th and 9th episodes of In the Shadows of Utopia, which is a podcast hosted by Lachlan Peters on the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. For more on the specific historical origins of communist theory and Marxism, I also recommend the first 8 episodes of the 10th series of Mike Duncan's Revolutions on the Russian Revolution. Both Lachlan and Mike are great hosts, easy to listen to, and provide thorough backgrounds on the development of communist thought from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels through to Lenin and his Soviet comrades. In the Shadows of Utopia is actually one of my favorite ongoing podcasts, and Revolutions is one of the inspirations for this podcast, so I highly recommend both of them, whether or not you're interested in learning more about the history of communism specifically. More importantly, both move past the surface-scraping tendencies of so-called dad history, while staying both relatively easy to understand in their historical criticism and exhaustive enough to be called good histories of their subjects. Okay. Now, finally, on to what I think we should understand about communism as it pertains to Korea in 1945. Communism as it is in 1945 began in the middle of the 19th century with the writings of Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx. Marx's intellectual thinking matched well with Engels' experience in industrial Manchester, allowing both to build the core tenets of what we now call Marxism. I guess Engelsism doesn't really roll off the tongue now, does it? Marxism is built on a socio-economic philosophical view of history based around the material conditions of people. It is not a specific form of governance, it is a framework for historical, political, sociological, economic, cultural, etc. analysis. Marx and Engels say that what really matters in the development of human society is not the ideals it is built around, but the material conditions that are both the causes and effects of the economic structure of the society. In a Marxist framework of human development, capitalism is just another link in the historical chain. In capitalism, there is a bourgeoisie class made up of capitalists that own the factories and the fields and the machines, and a proletarian class made up of anyone who sells their labor for a wage and don't own the fruits of their labor. There are other class divisions like the peasants and farmers or the petite bourgeoisie of small business owners, but the bourgeoisie and proletariat are the big two. Marx writes that, and this is important to future communists, the goals of the capitalist and the worker are inherently different. The capitalist's greed will drive them in a competitive market to take actions that increase their profits at the expense of others. This negatively impacts the proletariat and does not allow them to experience the full benefits of their labor. This statement on the nature of capitalism, that I don't think is incorrect, given the long history of exploitative capitalism both here in the United States and around the world, is the heart of the eventual conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union after World War II. Of course, it would get roped in with a more generic great power conflict of global dominance, which we will get to sometime soon, but that statement is really important to understanding the future breakdown of the Grand Alliance of the Second World War. Okay, so capitalism is the penultimate form of economic development in a Marxist framework. What's the final form? Well, it's kinda up for grabs so long as it centers around commonly owned means of production. But whatever it is, though, the final form of socialized means of production would be achieved through socialist revolution. Socialist revolution was very important in communist theory because it would enable the proletariat to educate themselves into class consciousness and empower them to take control of their society away from exploitative capitalists. This necessity of socialist revolution is kind of a bugbear for Korean communists in 1945. They never had that revolution. Their society was liberated by the Soviets and the Americans, and what power communists did achieve to reshape Korean society, they only achieved in part of the country and only because of the goals of the Soviets. How do we get from Marxism to Soviet communism? Things really kick into high gear around the Russian Revolution of 1917. Vladimir Lenin becomes the leading communist theorist and chieftain of Russian communists, with Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky as key followers. Both build their own profiles and theories of communism under Lenin's tutelage. Trotsky's global communism and theory of permanent revolution is blindsided by Stalin's rapid rise to power after Lenin's death. With Stalin's preeminence in the still young Soviet Union, the idea of socialism in one country takes hold, building Soviet nationalism into Soviet communism and setting the model for the relationship between nationalism and communism for future communist societies. By 1925-1930, Stalin's in power, Russia's gone red and is now the Soviet Union, and the Communist International is established to advocate for global communism by engaging communists in places like Korea. Except they don't really do too good a job of that. Korean communists were too fractured to form a cohesive communist party, and they would stay that way for the next 20 years or so, at least until 1945. Stalin's control spread to every part of the Soviet state and of the Communist Party. Stalinism was not strictly an ideology, it is more a way of naming the ways in which Stalin steered both the Soviet state and the Communist Party towards his goals while brutally suppressing any dangerous dissent. This is not to say that Stalin was the end-all be-all of the state, that's a bit too reductive. Sheila Fitzgerald's work shows that Stalin built a strong leadership team capable of making their own decisions, and whose opinions Stalin regularly considered. Those team members often deferred to Stalin, though, and were well attuned to Stalin's probable decisions. There's also the small matter of Stalin's cult of personality, but we can get into that later when it has more direct bearing on our story. Stalinism is especially important to our history because it provides two of our future friends, Mao and Kim, a model for leadership, with themselves at the center of the state. In short, communism is a system of governance built around the common ownership of economic capital through the abolition of class hierarchy. Of the factions of Korean and Soviet communists that existed in 1945, this is the thing that ties them together. Well, that and the support of the Soviet Union. I have said it before and I will continue to say it. The story of the Korean War is a tragedy because the original sin of Korea, its division, was imposed on the Korean people and their land by the United States and the Soviet Union. Koreans on both sides of the 38th parallel did not choose their form of government. If they had, well, Northern Korea was a bit more conservative than Southern Korea, and Southern Korea had many more communists than Northern Korea, at least in 1945. As the Soviets moved into Northern Korea on August 11th, they had a few decisions to make, and as we'll discuss in a minute, they had to do it all on the fly. First, was an occupation necessary? That was answered pretty quickly. The Soviets began putting an occupation administration into place almost as soon as the Red Army pushed the Japanese south of the 38th. This was not a matter for the military commanders of the 25th Army tasked with liberating Korea. The key Soviet figures at this early stage of the Soviet occupation were the political commissar for the 25th Army, Major General N.G. Lebedev, and the political commissar for the 1st Far Eastern Front, the organization above the 25th Army, Colonel General Terenty Fomich Shtaikov. Both Lebedev and Shtaikov were active politically and had large roles to play in the next few years of Northern Korean politics. Shtaikov especially was impressive. He joined the party at the age of 22, and after 20 years of service to the party, was one of 3 commissars at the high rank of Colonel General. There are, of course, others in the Soviet camp that have a hand in the occupation of Northern Korea, but we will get to them in due time. Shtaikov and Lebedev, for now, are the 2 names to remember. As we covered last week, the Japanese remained south of the 38th parallel to protect those Japanese civilians still trying to leave Korea. How hard were the Japanese going to fight? Not too much, as they surrendered on the 15th and didn't put up too much resistance before that. Were the Soviets really going to stop at the 38th parallel and comply with the American request for a divided occupation? Yeah, they did that without a fuss. As discussed 2 weeks ago, Stalin sent down the order to stop at the 38th, and a smart officer in the Red Army in 1945 was not going to challenge Stalin. The most important decision of all as Soviet forces arrived at the 38th and in the major population centers of Northern Korea was who was going to take the lead on the occupation. To answer this, we have to slow down a bit because I want to talk about a few different groups of people. There's no easy way to describe these groups in short, so I guess we'll just take the long way through this. According to Andrei Lenkov, there are two connected but distinct processes kicking off with the beginning of the Soviet occupation: the Soviet effort to build a communist state in Korea, and an interfactional struggle for control of that state by four communist Korean factions: the guerrillas, the Soviets, the Yan'an, and the domestic. The domestic faction were those communists I mentioned last week that took part in the Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence and the early days of the Korean People's Republic. The Yan'an faction was a group of activists that formed in China from Korean emigres and was more or less attached to the Chinese Communist Party until 1945, carrying with them a more Chinese form of communism when they arrived back in Korea. The Soviet faction was, naturally, those ethnic Koreans born in the Soviet Union and who became an important part of the Soviet occupation force as members of the Red Army. The last faction, the guerrillas, we've already met. These were the Koreans who fought the Japanese in Manchuria under commanders like Kim Il-sung. The domestic faction was first to take charge in Korea simply because they never left. The guerrillas were the next to arrive with the Red Army. The Soviet and Yan'an factions arrived during the first few months of the occupation and then trickled in over the next few years. Whatever happened in the coming months in regards to the future government of Korea, these four factions would have to find a way to form one communist party together. For the time being, a fifth group would have to take the reins. Each main army of the Red Army had a seventh department made up of political experts and area specialists. Generally, the 7th Department would manage relationships with local authorities whenever an army unit was involved in a campaign outside of Soviet territory. The 25th Army's 7th Department would have to take a leading role in the early days of the Soviet occupation because of one big problem. The Soviets hadn't really thought through this part of the plan. They executed the invasion of Manchuria and Korea spectacularly, and were helped with that by the collapse of the Imperial Japanese Army, but they did not concern themselves with the issue of Korea before they had to. That's why the Korean guerrillas in the Red Army, like those under the command of Kim, did not take part in the Manchuria and Korea campaigns. And that's why translators were not immediately embedded with the command units in the 25th Army as they moved down the peninsula. There weren't even Korea specialists in the 7th Department, under the general command of Lebedev and the direct command of Lieutenant Colonel G.K. Meckler. The men involved were just your regular run-of-the-mill party operatives that gravitated towards the kind of work most 7th Departments usually did. Quote-unquote, psychological operations. This was not helped by the fact that, during Stalin's purges of the 1930s, a great many Soviet Koreans and Soviet experts on Korea were purged, killed, murdered. Those that made it through the purges were pretty much sidelined, as China and Japan experts were just more important to the Soviets during the war. The occupation started as soon as the Soviets arrived in Korea, even though they were woefully unprepared to actually occupy a foreign country. The actual decision to place a specific organization in control of the occupation was not made until August 25th. Only then did the commander of the First Far Eastern Front, the guy above Shtaikov, choose the 25th Army as the occupying force. But really, there wasn't any other reasonable option they could make, considering the 25th had already been in Korea for about 2 weeks. With that settled, they needed a location for the occupation headquarters: Pyongyang or Hamhung. Hamhung is in the crook of the peninsula on the east coast, so it would have been a reasonable choice with quick access to both Manchuria and Vladivostok. Pyongyang, however, was the largest city in the Soviet zone, was a historic capital in Korean society, and had decent access to rail networks as well as the LOC on the west coast of the peninsula. All of this made Pyongyang a much stronger choice and gave the occupation that much more historical and political legitimacy. By the time the Soviets had made that decision, the occupation had gotten off to a rocky start. Soviet troops were partaking in some unsavory behaviors, like looting, rape, theft, and the like. Remember, these were men who had been at war for years and had finally achieved peace, but were still separated from their homeland. They were bored and surrounded by that specific type of masculinity that tends to end in bad situations. This would remain a problem for Soviet commanders and Korean citizens through the first couple weeks of September and be a point of conflict between locals and occupiers. This conflict subsided some as more ethnic Koreans were placed in leadership positions within the occupation, but even then most of the new Northern Korean leadership had not been in Korea for long, if at all. Like Kim, most spoke better Chinese or Russian than Korean, and although they connected with their ethnic compatriots, they had deeper ties to their political comrades. The Soviets did not find nothing when they settled into Pyongyang. Cho Man-sik, who Lankov describes as the Korean Gandhi, had started a people's committee along the lines of Yo Eun-young's down in Seoul. Cho was a strong nationalist and was well regarded by Koreans of all political stripes in the peninsula. Like its southern counterparts, Cho's committee covered many different areas of responsibility necessary for successful governance, like public order, finance, and local administration. There were even fewer communist members in Cho's committee than those in the south, but overall, it was a good cross-section of political sentiment in Pyongyang. Northern Korea was much more conservative than Southern Korea, where communists had a major base of support in and around Seoul. When the officers of the 25th Army arrived in Pyongyang on August 26th, Cho and his colleagues began meeting with the Soviets, especially Lebedev, the next 3 days to establish the rules of their relationship. At some point during these meetings, someone from the Soviet camp pointed out that there were not that many communists in the committee. Sources are unclear on whether or not this came from Lebedev or from his commander I.M. Chistyakov, but either way, by September, that problem was rectified. There was a satisfactory number of communists on the committee now. It is unknown if this was an attempt to push Cho Man-sik further to the left, but it is known that Lebedev did not particularly like Cho's style of leadership, or Cho's style of communication, or Cho in general. Mostly, that was because of cultural differences between Koreans and Russians that, because there were no area specialists attached to his command, Lebedev just had no knowledge of. Even then, Cho was still the Soviets' first choice to lead the Korean part of the occupation. He had a strong source of legitimacy as a domestic resistance activist against the Japanese and was popular among Koreans. The only problem is that he was not a big fan of communism. Despite this intense dislike, Cho was willing to work with the Soviets as long as they took a hands-off approach to their occupation. That was not going to happen. Cho continuously tried to just do his own thing and not really undermine the authority the Soviets felt they had. Cho was not arrogant about it. I think it's very reasonable for Cho to believe he was mostly in charge of things in Pyongyang, as he was a Korean leader of a Korean administration governing Korean people. But that conflict between the two opposing ideas about who was really in charge would lead to the Soviets realizing that Cho would not be their man in Korea. By the first week of October, the Soviets knew that there needed to be a change in local leadership if the relationship between the Koreans and Soviets was to remain effective. Who could reasonably replace Cho, the great beacon of nationalism in the north? Down in Seoul, the reconstructed Korean Communist Party was growing stronger under the leadership of Pak Han-young. You might remember Pak from last week's episode on the Korean People's Republic. He was one of the founders of the KPR and worked closely with his moderate allies towards a fully unified Korean national government. Bruce Cummings describes Pak as the greatest leader of Korean communism. Really, Pak checked all 3 of the necessary boxes to be Cho's replacement. He was an ardent communist, he was in Korea, and he had a legitimate claim as a leader of Korean nationalism. Unfortunately for Pak, he was on the wrong side of the 38th parallel. The Soviets had a secret 4th box they needed checked. They wanted someone close at hand they could control. Luckily, the Soviets had a well-placed alternative in Pyongyang that fulfilled their desires. I, of course, am talking about our friend Kim Il-sung. After arriving in Wonsan on August 17, 1945, and making it to Pyongyang by late September, Kim was selected as the deputy commandant for Pyongyang, the highest Korean in the local office of the largest city in the Soviet zone that would become the headquarters of the Soviet Civil Administration. The SCA was a purely military body that oversaw the daily administration of the occupation. It was not fully proclaimed until October 3rd, but there's not much difference between the Soviet occupation force in September and the Soviet Civil Administration in October, except for the name. The SCA did shift the occupation slightly in the organization of the Red Army, as it fell directly under the command of Commissar Shtaikov, instead of a purely military command. The SCA also actually tried to enlist Soviet Koreans into the Red Army as translators and cultural specialists. As more communist Koreans arrived in Korea, Cho's position weakened until it grew untenable in the eyes of the Soviets, and Kim Il-sung was chosen as the leader of whatever government would form in northern Korea. Kim and Cho actually met each other on September 30th, with Kim tagging along with Meckler in one last attempt to convince Cho to cooperate with the Soviets. Cho refused his full cooperation, and 2 weeks later, Kim was introduced to the Korean people at a rally honoring the Red Army. That rally has gone through a heavy cycle in the North Korean washing machine. The North Koreans today say 100,000 attended the rally in Kim's honor, in which Kim single-handedly sparked the communist spirit of the nation. Like many things in the North Korean hagiography of Kim, though, the truth is very different. Lebedev introduced Kim, who was wearing a borrowed suit with his Red Army medal and Order of the Red Banner pinned to his chest. He then gave a speech that was written in Russian by Soviet political aides and translated into Korean by Soviet Koreans. Kim struggled through some of the pronunciations because he had spent so much time away from Korea, and many in attendance were confused by how young he appeared to be. I think I've said it before, but as a reminder, Korean culture respects age and wisdom a great deal, and Kim certainly did not look the part of semi-legendary gorilla. Kim was not yet the golden son of the Soviets, but this rally marked a clear crossroads in North Korean political development. Cho also spoke to those in attendance, but hereafter his power would decline. The Communist Party of North Korea was founded on October 13th. Wait a second, that's not right. Yes, okay. The North Korean Bureau of the Communist Party of Korea was founded on October 13th in Pyongyang. This was a subordinate body to PAC's party in Seoul, which was confirmed by a cable sent south supporting PAC as leader of the party. For some reason, they didn't publicize the new bureau until a week later, and no one really knows why. From 1958 onward, this bureau was officially described in North Korea as the Organizational Bureau of the Communist Party of North Korea, and its foundation was moved to October 10th when it was made an official national holiday. Maybe they changed it for the date alliteration? 1010 does sound pretty nice. Other than that, no one really knows why. The first head of the bureau was not the Comrade Kim we know. It was another Comrade Kim, Kim Young-bom. This Kim was less famous than his wife, Pak Chung-ae, who probably would have been a better choice for leader. Kim Young-bom was a modest man, not well known, and he had unfortunate ties to those Soviet Koreans purged in the 1930s. Lenkov attributes this Kim's rapid rise and fall to the quote-unquote general confusion and disarray which reigned supreme in Korea immediately after liberation. Kim Young-bom would be replaced as chief Korean communist in the north by Kim Il-sung on December 17th, after a relatively calm and orderly November for Korean communists. In the meantime, Cho did not want to go quietly into the night. When the Soviets began allowing political parties, Cho formed his Democratic Party to advocate for his conservative beliefs. Instead, the Soviets rigged it so that two communists and friends of Kim, Cho Yong-gon and Kim Chek, were elected to the party chairmanship and secretaryship, respectively. In early January of 1946, in the aftermath of a meeting I think we'll discuss next week, Cho resigned from his leadership position in protest of Soviet actions and was arrested and imprisoned for dissent. He would remain there until the North Koreans fled Pyongyang in the face of the American onslaught 5 years later. And that's where we'll leave our discussion for now, right around the end of 1945 in northern Korea. Next week, we'll discuss the first few months of the American occupation as part of this accidental 2-part episode series. If you like what you're hearing, please leave a review or let me know. I'd love to hear from listeners what I'm doing right and what I'm doing wrong. This is only episode 5, so there's still lots of things to learn. If you're on social media, you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram as @CTCA Podcast. If you're not on social media, you can find more information, including the references for today's episode, at ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. That's ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. We release new episodes every Tuesday. Please be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. I am Trevor Owens, and this is Coming Together, Coming Apart. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week.